War on the Border 2025. I'm Will Haynes of the Watkins Museum of History, and I'm currently dwarfed by these bookshelves behind me because I'm live streaming here at the, or from the beautiful Kramer Family Research Room here at the museum. Our theme for Civil War on the Border 2025 is religion during the Civil War. And we picked this theme because it was inspired by a current exhibit we have titled Foundations of Faith, Early Churches of Lawrence, on view through September 20th. So if you're in the area, we encourage you to come in and view that exhibit before it closes. Author talks for Civil War on the Border 2025 are sponsored by John Nalbandian, so we thank you, John. This week, we'll be speaking with a great lineup of distinguished historians. Today, I'm excited to welcome George C. Rable, Professor Emeritus with the History Department of the University of Alabama. And if you're an American history geek like me or a Civil War geek, you know that George is a pretty big deal. Today, George and I will talk about his book, God's Almost Chosen Peoples. There it is. A Religious History of the American Civil War. This book received the Jefferson Davis Award from the American Civil War Museum, and it was listed as a choice outstanding academic title. So, George, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. A topic I love to talk about.
Great. Well, I'm going to jump right into it. Your book's title, God's Almost Chosen Peoples, comes from a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave soon after his election as president, in which he said, I shall be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty and of this his almost chosen people. I know a lot of folks have been struck by that phrasing in the years since. So tell us, what did Lincoln mean by that?
Well, that seems like a question, but it's far from a simple question. It comes from a speech, as you note, and this was a speech that Lincoln gave to the New Jersey State Senate in Trenton as he was traveling to Washington for the inauguration. Along the route, Lincoln made short speeches at several places, and people listened with some interest, given the president was coming in at a time of severe crisis, and they looked for hints about how he would treat the secession crisis. In any event, he gave this talk in Trenton, and in the talk, he recalled reading Parson Weems' Life of Washington about the Revolutionary War battle at Trenton. Some of your listeners may know Parson Weems. He's the origin of the famous cherry tree story. In any event, Lincoln said he'd read Weems' Life of Washington. He'd read about the battle at Trenton. And then he goes on to say, I am exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. And I shall be most happy indeed if I shall be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty and of this his almost chosen people for perpetuating the object of that great struggle. What Lincoln meant by that is not entirely clear. Certainly the idea of Americans as a chosen people or perhaps a new Israel goes back to the New England Puritans. There was a widespread belief in Lincoln's day that the United States was an exceptional nation with perhaps a divinely inspired mission. Notice, however, with the phrase almost chosen, Lincoln hedges his bets on that point. And we really don't quite know what he means by almost chosen. Now, my title became plural because Mike Parrish suggested I make people peoples, since I'm talking about Northerners and Southerners. This, however, has led to the title often being cited incorrectly, which is people rather than the plural peoples. In fact, it's cited, I think, incorrectly more often than correctly. They cite Lincoln correctly and they cite me incorrectly.
Well, that must be a little frustrating for you.
Well, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, but it's more amusing than frustrating.
Yeah, well, it is a really striking phrase. And it leads me into my next question, which is, what inspired you to take on the large and complex subject of religion during the Civil War?
I can tell you at times I regretted doing it. It is a large and complex subject. The origin is actually fairly simple. It has two origins. First of all, Gary Gallagher and Mike Parrish, two very accomplished Civil War historians, invited me to write a volume in their Littlefield History of the Civil War era. A very important series of 16 books, most of which have now appeared. They suggested a topic, one I'd worked on before, and they wanted me to write an overall comprehensive work on this particular subject. I won't specify what that is, but I simply said I'd already written one mediocre book on the subject and didn't want to write another one. But I offered religion as an alternative, and Gary and Mike were very receptive. I had slowly developed an interest in the religious history of the period while working on previous subjects. It seemed to me religion was everywhere when I was doing research on Fredericksburg, on Southern women, on Confederate politics. Any topic I'd worked on before, religion sometimes hovered around it. And so you're right about a very complex subject. In fact, if readers aren't satisfied, there are two even longer versions of my book on my computer. It was a gargantuan manuscript when it started out, and I obviously had to pare it down. But the subject, I think, deserves a fairly large treatment.
It is a massive subject, and that is again a perfect segue into my next question, because I'd always assumed, and I've done research on the Civil War. Not on religion per se, but it always crops up in letters, newspaper articles from the period, things like that. And these accounts had always made me assume that Americans were very devout during this era. But it's more complicated than that, because you estimate, I believe you said that these are my words, but you're basically saying only a small percentage of soldiers were very religious. And if I'm mischaracterizing your argument there, let me know. And you also say that Americans had what you call crises of faith. So what were the major issues facing Christians during the sectional divide that led to the Civil War? And why were so many Americans apparently resistant to some of these religious appeals?
Well, I do think substantial minority rather than small percentage would be more accurate. Though in presenting talks on this subject, I usually start with this question: how religious were Americans on the eve of the Civil War? There was a study done in 1855 in a population of 27 million. The study tried to estimate how large would be the population who were members of some Protestant church. And I've often kicked off talks asking, okay, out of 27 million, how many do you think? And people would give various estimates, usually fairly high. This study said there were only 4 million that were members of some Protestant church. Now you could throw in a million or so Roman Catholics, 50 or 60,000 Jews, perhaps some other groups as well. But that number seems shocking. But there's an explanation for it, I think. The number reflected a period of remarkable evangelical growth in many ways, but it also reflected the fact that standards for church membership in the 19th century were very demanding. Some churches, Baptists in particular, required that you had to give a public testimony in front of the congregation, and then the congregation would vote on whether they would admit you as a member. Many churches, not only Baptists, but Methodists, Presbyterians, and others, also exacted fairly strong standards for behavior, and they supervised their membership and occasionally expelled people. There's all kinds of debates in Baptist churches during the war about dancing. Even toward the end of the Confederacy, Baptist church minutes are often debating whether Sister Smith or Brother Jones should be excluded because they'd been caught dancing somewhere. They approved of dancing. So given these exacting standards of membership, it's not surprising that these membership numbers seem relatively low. Church attendance itself would be much higher.
Mhm.
There would probably be more people attending churches in this period who are not members than
Mm.
there would be in our own time. I mean, we think of churches today, most people in the congregation on any given Sunday morning are probably members of the church. I mean, there's a few visitors, there's a few people checking out a church, but most of them would be members. You could not assume that in the 19th century. Plus, with a scattered rural population, it becomes very difficult for some people to access any kind of church at all. So that may explain those numbers. But still, religion is important. It's
Right.
pervasive. It's everywhere. And certainly, Americans used religious faith in a very broad sense to interpret events in their own lives and in the nation's life. They do this before the war. They do this during the war. They do this after the war. If your cow dies, maybe that's divine providence. If your side lost a battle, maybe that's divine providence. So religious terminology and language and use of the Bible are everywhere, especially this strong sense of divine providence. And I wouldn't really say either that Americans during the sectional crisis were resistant to religious
Mm.
appeals. The slavery question, for example, was often debated in religious and moral terms, again, going back to the Bible. Lots of debate over scripture, how to read the Bible, whether the Bible sustained slavery or disapproved of slavery. Many arguments, long and learned and sometimes tedious arguments about the Bible and slavery. Of course, both the Methodist and Baptist denominations before the war divided over the slavery question. And some Americans thought that the temperance question was of equal importance to the slavery question. And not surprisingly, that, of course, was often framed in religious and moral terms. So, religious language and terminology and belief were pervasive, exerted a powerful influence on the culture, the print culture, newspapers, periodicals, magazines, what was published. The volume of published sermons in this period is absolutely staggering, especially sermons by Presbyterians. The Presbyterians would put a heavy emphasis on sermonizing, and they put a heavy emphasis on publishing sermons. So that's a long and convoluted answer to your question about the pervasiveness of belief and religious activity.
Right. And let's dig a little bit deeper on the slavery issue, the cause of the war to begin with. How did Southern ministers and other Southern Christians deal? And I'm hearing a lot of police sirens outside our window here, which may be responding to this, divisive issue of, or this alarming issue of slavery during the Civil War. But how did Southern ministers and other Southern Christians deal with this enormous issue of slavery and defend slaveholding in Christian terms?
Well, for the most part, they did defend slaveholding in both theory and practice. They would start with the Bible. They would point out that the patriarchs of the Old Testament held slaves. They would point out that Jesus never said anything against slavery.
Right.
He didn't say anything about slavery, actually, that we know of or that survived. Certainly, the Apostle Paul said slaves should obey their masters. And so, as far as the Southerners concerned, that locked up the argument that slavery was an ancient, biblically sanctioned institution. It was a morally upright institution that uplifted the African slaves, that allowed African slaves access to salvation. And of course, the question of religion among the slaves is a complex one as well. And Southern slave owners actually debated this subject. Were Christianized slaves better slaves or worse slaves? Some masters thought that Christian slaves were better slaves. Some masters thought religion undermined slavery. So that's a sort of interesting side debate that goes on. Now, there were proposals during the war calling for the legal recognition of slave marriages. and for ending restriction on teaching slaves to read. There were some clergy and some slaveholders that favored both of those. But none of these, even though some were introduced into state legislatures, none of these even came to a vote. There was not even a roll call vote taken on any of these proposals, perhaps because of the war, but also I think perhaps there simply wasn't enough general support for this. Because there was some concern, if slaves are able to read, again, this will undermine the institution of slavery. Some ardent Confederates believed that what would really happen is that the world would eventually come around to their position on slavery. That the sort of tide of history against slavery would reverse itself. The Confederate nation would set such an example of a slaveholding republic, it would bring on a kind of pro-slavery millennium that would spread throughout the world. And in their sermons, and this is common North and South during the war, sermons often focus on the fact that the war has come about, battles have been fought, battles have been lost, because the Lord was punishing people and the nation for various sins. And certainly Southern ministers talked in this way, especially when the war was going badly. But they usually did not list slaveholding as one of those sins. They might list intemperance, they might list swearing, they might list Sabbath breaking, they might list greedy materialism, they might even list political partisanship as terrible sins, but usually, almost universally, they did not list slavery as one of those sins. Though I think it's important to say, too, toward the end of the war, some Confederates concluded, however reluctantly, that perhaps the Lord did will the end of slavery after all. They weren't sure why that would be. They were even less sure why the Lord would allow the godless Yankees to prevail. But there's some sense that perhaps the war had to end slavery, even among some Confederates, by the end of the war.
Well, it seems shocking to us today that they could downplay slavery or even, think that their beliefs justified it. But when you've been brought up in that system, that probably lends you to that attitude. To move to a different topic, and one of the many topics that you discuss in your book, I was fascinated to read about the lack of support that regimental chaplains faced, both from their governments and the men under their charge. Chaplains, of course, being the ministers that were assigned to the different regiments and to hospitals, too, on both sides. So that leads me to wonder what kind of men became chaplains during the war, and what were their duties, and why, in some cases, were they so unpopular?
This subject I became very interested in. There's quite a bit of good work on chaplains with various emphases, and it simply became part of this subject. And soldiers and their commanding officers talked about chaplains quite a bit. Chaplains were expected to hold services. They were expected to offer spiritual counsel to the troops. But they also visited hospitals. They wrote letters for the men. They saw that pay was sent home to the families, that people thought you could trust the chaplain with the pay. And the best chaplains developed a loyal following in their regiment. Now, the soldiers themselves, and I quote a number in the book, often expressed very strong opinions about chaplains, negative and positive. The complainers emphasized poor sermons. In fact, some thought the chaplains simply brought old sermons from back home and delivered them in the camps, even though they weren't appropriate. One soldier complained that a chaplain one time delivered a Sunday sermon on motherhood, obviously a Mother's Day effort back. They also complained that some chaplains were seldom around. You never saw them. They didn't hold services very regularly. Some of the soldiers and their officers said, well, a lot of these chaplains are simply failed preachers from back home. They couldn't make it back home, and so they joined the Army thinking they could make it in the Army. Some chaplains were simply appointed because of a connection with the colonel of the regiment. Some of these were simply patronage appointments. A cousin or friend of the colonel would become a chaplain regardless of qualifications. Soldiers also noticed, as they well might, how chaplains behaved in a battle. Did they help the wounded off the field, or did they flee at the first smell of gunpowder? And soldiers greatly respected the chaplains that showed a certain amount of courage, bravery. Chaplains were not supposed to wield arms, but every once in a while, a chaplain would pick up a discarded weapon in the heat of battle and fire away. Now, there were a good number of chaplains that passed what we might call these soldier tests, and they greatly respected those chaplains. One soldier commented on their chaplain, "We will stick to him every time." I think in part because he stuck to them. And so there's a very mixed record of the chaplains. There's some very good ones, and there's a lot in between. It is interesting, and this surprised me in the research, that neither side seemed to appreciate chaplains all that much. In fact, both the Union and Confederate governments reduced the pay of chaplains during the war. There's an amazing number of regiments who either have no chaplain or most of the time have no chaplain, even in units that are noted for their piety. Sometimes there's an absence of chaplains. And the chaplain's duty was tough. It was tough. And some of the chaplains were older men, and so sometimes they were in bad health and didn't last very long for that reason. So it's a mixed picture. It's a picture of courage and commitment, and it's also a story of slacking and failure.
Yeah, just as you say, they were really a mixed bag, these chaplains. Your book includes a great story about Lorenzo Barber, who was the chaplain for the sharpshooters in the Union Army. And he, like you said, he occasionally picked up a rifle and took his own, turn shooting at sniping at the Rebs. So that's just amazing. And I remember reading the diary of a chaplain once, and he talked, because you mentioned how they were often entrusted with bringing the soldiers' pay home or transporting the pay. And he mentioned in his diary, he was traveling home with the pay of the regiment in a saddlebag, and he used the saddlebag as a pillow, and he slept on it on his way back home. And of course, that was how he protected this huge bag of money too. So their duties could vary quite a bit. To move on to another topic, I remember reading a long time ago this very old book. It was called, I think it was called Christ in the Camp, and it was about the Confederate Army revivals during the war. And you talk about this in your own book too. So tell us, why did these large-scale revivals sweep the Confederate armies beginning at about the midpoint or a little bit later during the war? Why did that happen, and what did these revivals look like?
Well, I'll start out with something of a qualification. Their revivals really are quite commonplace in both armies. The Confederate revivals were probably better publicized. The book you allude to, Christ in the Camp, a very long book with detailed comments on the revivals. There was another book called Narrative of the Great Revivals that did the same thing. So I think the Confederate revivals were more publicized. Now, in terms of 1863, think about the year 1862. It was a very bloody year. It was a year of horribly large and bloody battles. And the winter of 1862-63, when the soldiers are in winter quarters, you see the beginning of sustained revivalism. I think stimulated by the slaughters of 1862. Also, these winter camps were not exactly vacation spots. Pervasive disease, often poor rations, considerable soldier suffering, even in the camps themselves. And I think all of it, especially the carnage and soldier suffering, stimulated religious revival. These are supported by chaplains, but they're also supported by visiting missionaries. Churches would send missionaries to the camp. Eventually, on the Union side, the United States Christian Commission sent missionaries in a more organized fashion than the Confederacy did. And so there were stirrings in the federal camps as well as the Confederate camps. Even so, I think it's fair to say that the devout remained a minority among the soldiers. In fact, a historian who studied Lee's army extensively came up to me at a party once, and he knew what I was working on, and he sort of leaned over and whispered, "Do you think the majority of these people were terribly devout?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Good. That's what I think too." But still, it's a substantial minority. And you can look at individual soldiers and you can see examples of enormous religious devotion. I remember finding a diary in the Virginia State Archives, a long soldier diary, but it's basically a spiritual diary. That's about all he talks about, his spiritual life at tremendous length. So the devout may have been a minority, but they were an important minority, and they're a minority that did a good deal of the fighting, I think it's safe to say, on both sides, because religion can be a powerful motivator for soldiers. If you think you're doing the Lord's work, you may pursue that work all the harder.
That's a great point. So in the epilogue of your book, you assert that I'm going to get the quote here correctly. You assert that, quote, the Civil War had in fact been the holiest war in American history, but you put holiest in quotes. So could you explain what you meant by that?
Well, I meant it when I said it, but it's proved to be a somewhat controversial subject. I once referred in a public speech at a college to the Civil War as a holy war, and one student strongly objected. He thought it had to be a holy war in terms that we would understand in the 20th or 21st century, and so we went back and forth a little bit on that. What I meant by holiest war in American history, I think never before and not since had so many ministers, churches, and ordinary people interpreted a war in religious terms. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in the diaries, it's in the letters. It's used to interpret the outcome of battles, both victories and defeat. Soldiers and civilians talk a great deal about the Lord's will. They talk a great deal about divine providence. As I said at the outset, the religious language is simply pervasive. It's everywhere. You don't have to hunt for it very much. In fact, in other research projects since, I keep running into even more stuff that I could have used on the subject in my book. And I don't think any war before or since has been interpreted in such overtly religious terms. And people persistently turn to the Bible for answers, especially given both the duration of the war and the carnage. There was one Confederate work written, I'm not sure I'll get the title exactly right, but it doesn't matter. It's something about the Confederacy and divine prophecy. And this was a long, and I must say rather turgid tome, pointing to any example in Scripture that the writer could latch onto to show the Confederacy had been anticipated in prophecy. And since so many Americans, North and South, interpreted the causes, course, and consequences of the war in terms of divine providence, I think this shows how important religion was to the war, a topic that traditionally historians neglected at their peril, but no longer. Lots of historians are working on the subject now, and I certainly welcome that.
You're right that this has become a much more common topic among authors lately, and yeah, it's really interesting. So, your book concentrates on Christianity, and most Americans were Christian at this time. But what other, and you mentioned this earlier, but what other religions had sizable followings during the period, and did their followers react to the war differently than Christians did in some cases?
Well, you have to make some distinction among Christians too. The denominations vary, and denominationalism was very important. For example, there was some question in the Confederate Army about baptism. You know, Baptists insist on baptism by immersion. Methodists would use sprinkling, and so there was some question: if you're a Methodist and the chaplain insists on immersion, what are you going to do? So there's the question of denominational differences. There's also an interesting between Protestants and Catholics that I had not anticipated in starting this subject. In fact, I think historians in the past really studied religion in the war almost solely in terms of Protestants. Well, I think the Catholics have an interesting take on this, because the Catholic Church, unlike the Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians, who further divide during the war, and the Episcopalians somewhat divide as well, the Catholic Church does not divide. And Northern Catholics, who somewhat support the Union, but some also lean toward the Copperhead view of things. Northern Catholics simply say, if you have a Protestant nation, this is what you get. You get division. Protestants are inherently schismatic. Therefore, the war is caused by Protestantism, which is an interesting take. But Northern and Southern Catholics, like Northern and Southern Methodists or Baptists or Episcopalians or Presbyterians, they go with their section. If you want to know what their stance on the war is, ask where they live. Don't ask which church they go to, because it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference. Now, there are minorities of Jews in both the North and South, and like the Catholics and Protestants, the Jews largely went along with their sections, not surprising for a religious minority. There was also considerable anti-Semitism in both the North and the South. There's Grant's famous order ordering Jews out of Memphis. There's attacks on Judah Benjamin in the Confederate cabinet. When Benjamin acquired a new position, a Richmond newspaper sneered that the representation of the synagogue had not been diminished. On both sides, there are accusations about Jewish speculators who are hoarding and taking advantage of the war. So anti-Semitism crops up. There is the question of chaplains. The Union Congress specified that chaplains be Christians initially, but they eventually dropped that requirement. There was at least one Jewish regimental chaplain, and there were several Jewish hospital chaplains. I found no evidence of any Jewish Confederate chaplains. The Mormons are an interesting case study. I didn't go into any detail about them, but Brigham Young has a very interesting take on the war. He viewed the Civil War as divine judgment, divine chastisement for the enemies of the Church of Latter-day Saints, particularly those who had killed the prophet Joseph Smith. So Brigham Young thought the nation was getting exactly what it deserved for its sins. He argued that the government had never really acknowledged God in his view. Now, this was a point also made by Confederates, because there's no invocation of religious faith in the U.S. Constitution, but there is in the Confederate Constitution. And so the Confederates like to point out how they were a holier people because their government rested on the word of God.
That's really interesting, because I had always read that, Southern people tended to denigrate Yankees, especially New England Yankees, for being Bible thumpers and that kind of thing. But I wasn't aware that, the Confederate Constitution mentioned religion in a way that the U.S. Constitution didn't. That's interesting.
Well, they're of two minds about that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of denunciations of New England Puritanism.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a whole book, a fun little book called Damn Yankees, about how Confederates demonized their Northern opponents. And it was interesting how much denunciation of New England Puritanism and religious hypocrisy and that sort of thing. But they also accused Northerners of infidelity. Mm-hmm. And they could square that by basically saying, well, New Englanders sound very biased, but really they're a bunch of hypocrites. And they don't really respect what the Bible says about slavery. They don't really believe in the literal word of God. Therefore, they are not really religious people. But that's the argument that's being used. And of course, a lot of Northerners would argue that the Confederates are godless slaveholders mm-hmm. who have deeply sinned against the Lord and deserve to be punished. And clergy on both sides talk a great deal about this whole question. What's the role of hatred and vengeance and that sort of thing? Some want to call it under control, and others really want to spread it. There are some very fire-breathing sermons on both sides against the enemy.
Right. And you mentioned this issue of Northerners condemning Southerners, white Southerners, as unholy because they owned slaves, or something along those lines. And Lincoln, although he famously didn't belong to a church, he did this in some of his more famous speeches, like the second inaugural. It's really interesting.
So it's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting. He does not condemn Southerners. He says the nation has been judged for the sins of slavery. And you know, what makes the second inaugural, there's a lot of things that make the second inaugural so important. I think every American ought to read the second inaugural. It's the greatest, in my view, it's the greatest speech ever delivered by an American president. It's not the Gettysburg Address, in my view. It's the second inaugural. And Lincoln, it's an interesting speech because the war's about over, but there's no sense of triumphalism in Lincoln. He doesn't brag about his own accomplishments. Imagine that. He simply says the course of military affairs has been favorable, and then drops the subject, and then meditates on the divine will and the role of providence in war. And he refuses to agree with many people in the North in saying that God was on their side. He will not say that. He says the Almighty has his own purposes.
Right.
And Lincoln doesn't say what those purposes might be, though he certainly strongly suggests that one of the purposes might have been to get rid of the institution of slavery. But it's a remarkable speech, as much for what Lincoln didn't say as for what he said, and for a speech that left questions unanswered. You know, presidents tend to try to, answer every question and wrap everything up and, say how great they are and things like that. Lincoln did not do that. He did not really embrace the religious views of many Northerners. And of course, as you mentioned, Lincoln did not join a church. His early religious beliefs were controversial. He was accused of being an unbeliever and an infidel. He once said he believed in the doctrine of necessity, but did not really say what that was. There's a kind of fatalism in Lincoln. If anything, he sounds more like a Calvinist than anything else. He sees divine judgment. He sees providence. And he doesn't necessarily see a triumphal outcome to any of this.
You're right. And that's another reason why it's such a remarkable speech, the second inaugural.
It's absolutely unique. I mean, it's absolutely unique. If you take, there's no president that's come even close to delivering a speech, anything like that, regardless of the quality. If you just look at what he said, how he said it, we would say today it's non-presidential. and people at the time did not react to it very favorably. as Lincoln himself noted. And he said to one of his political cronies, he says, "I think it's going to wear as well as anything I've ever done." And I think he was right about that. But the contemporary reaction was decidedly mixed, if not critical.
Well, he was certainly right about that. And, he was so prescient about so many things. And I'm going to be talking with our next two authors also about the second inaugural address. So if the audience is interested in that, you should join us for those talks as well. The book we've been discussing today is God's Almost Chosen Peoples, A Religious History of the American Civil War by George C. Rable. George, thank you so much for giving us your time and expertise today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Enjoyed it a great deal, Will.
I have too. And thanks to all of you out there as well for joining us today. And we'll see you next time. All right. Bye for now.